Good morning and welcome to this conference on introducing 20-minute neighbourhoods. It's really fantastic to have so many people joining us this morning, and I know we're still letting a few more people in, but I'm conscious we've got lots to get through, so we will make a start. My name is Fiona Howie and I'm the Chief Executive of the Town and Country Planning Association, and I'm going to be chairing the first two sessions of today's event, and then I will hand over to a colleague from Sport England to chair the third and final session this afternoon. In case some of our audience haven't come across the TCPA before, I wanted to briefly introduce us. We're a charity that works to challenge, inspire and support people to create healthy, sustainable and resilient places that are fair for everyone. And we're clear that the environments in which we live, work and play have profound impacts on our health and well-being. We know, for example, that substandard housing increases the likelihood of respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, as well as mortality. But our neighbourhoods are also crucially important to our physical and mental well-being. Areas that discourage walking and have poor cycling infrastructure, for example, can negatively impact residents' mental health and can increase the risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. We currently face economic challenges and climate, nature and health crises, and how we plan, design and create new places and regenerate existing ones will help or hinder work to tackle those issues. So it really is fantastic and positive that so many people are interested in the topic of 20-minute neighbourhoods. But of course, the idea of active environments and complete, compact and connected places is not new. We would argue that the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods links back to the Garden City model, which set out to create sustainable, healthy and well-designed communities. The TCPA was founded as part of the Garden City movement back in 1899, and the original garden cities of Letchworth and Welwyn were among the first attempts at delivering complete, sustainable communities, because they were designed to provide a range of local employment opportunities, diverse types of housing, walkable neighbourhoods with parks and access to locally produced food. I would also highlight right at the start that we're conscious that the 20-minute neighbourhood is a conceptually simple idea, but we recognise it's complex to put into practice. And I really hope that people will be able to explore that further through our presentations and speakers today. We're also very conscious that local authorities are under-resourced and under huge pressure, and that the planning system has faced and continues to face reform and deregulation. I do, however, hope that the presentations, as I say, will be, and the guide that we're launching later today, which I'll come back to briefly in a second, will help inspire people to think about places more holistically and what might be possible to help places, people and the environment to thrive. So before I hand over to our first speaker, we just quickly wanted to give people an overview of the sessions today, just as hopefully a helpful reminder. We have the agenda for our first session on the screen. As you'll see, we've got Nick speaking from Sport England, and then some colleagues from the TCPA talking about the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods or 15-minute city. What do we mean and why does it matter now? Next slide, please. We'll then, later this morning after a short break, we'll go on to session 2 to talk about creating complete and compact places. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Clara Fayard, was due to speak about the work she's involved in Paris to create a 15-minute city, but she's no longer able to join us, unfortunately. We do, however, still have fantastic speakers lined up from Space Syntax, Ipswich Central and David Locke Associates. Next slide, please. We'll then have an hour-long break to hopefully give people a bit of an opportunity to get away from their screens and have some food. And then we'll reconvene at 2 o'clock this afternoon for our third and final session, which again is about 20-minute neighbourhoods in practice. So talking about strategies, plans and processes for making them happen. Within each of the sessions, we've allowed plenty of time, we hope, for questions to panel members. So please do submit your questions using the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your screen. We know there's a chat function and it's fantastic that some people are using that already. but please, for submitting your questions please use the Q&A function just so I can hopefully try and keep track of them. I should also mention, again, we've mentioned it in the chat already, but we will make the slides and a recording of the event available afterwards to everybody. Next slide, please. Before introducing our first speaker, I must also take a moment to thank our sponsors today, Sport England, David Locke Associates and Ipswich Central. We really are most grateful for their support, and we're delighted to have all of them speaking today as part of this important work. And their support has enabled us to obviously hold the conference for free, which we're delighted to be able to do. I must also highlight, finally, before I hand over, next slide please, that we're launching today a new introductory guide to 20-minute neighbourhoods. My colleagues Julia and Tim will talk about the guide more and its contents and what we've learned through developing it and researching it. And there will be a link in the chat so that people can access that on our website to take home and read at your leisure. And so without any further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, Nick Evans. Nick is Head of Planning at Sport England with overall responsibility for their statutory role on the protection of playing fields and ensuring the land use planning system helps deliver sport and physical activity into everyday life. Welcome, Nick, and over to you.
Thank you, Fiona, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to start with a quote, if I may. It's so easy to be at home and not do anything during lockdown, but getting out on a bike, I find there were so many benefits to it. You get the fresh air, you get the exercise, and use it to get places. And those are the words of Harpreet Sandhu, a local resident in our Ealing local delivery parlour, who discovered the benefits of cycling during lockdown. And that is essentially what the 20-minute neighbourhood concept is all around, is creating the opportunities for those people to live locally and live their lives better locally. So you might be wondering why the Government Sports Development Agency is really interested in 20-minute neighbourhoods and why do they matter? Well, essentially, physical activity starts at home. And it's driven by those experiences we have that happen outside our doorstep, those walks that we have on our way to the shops, those walks to the parks, the use of those parks. And essentially what we call that is active environments, really creating the spaces and places for us to be more active. And like Harpreet, I think we've all discovered through the pandemic is what do we have on our doorstep? How we use those local spaces creatively to be more active. We discover those new spaces and footpaths we didn't really know about, or we've gone on our walk, on our local walk, and we've gone down a different street just to vary up that routine. And what essentially we've done, we've got to know our local neighbourhoods a little bit better. And that really resonates with the work we've been doing through our local delivery parlours, which is to drive change in terms of physical activity local. And those driving forces have been those communities who've really looked and really resonated with the places they really live in, from those streets to those neighbourhoods. So in essence, the 20-minute neighbourhood creates the opportunity to bring together some of the aspirations in our new strategy, United the Movement, to create healthy, active, prosperous communities. Now, the next slide, please. You know, I need to build this one up actually, so keep pressing the button on it. So I think what the pandemic has reminded us is really the importance of public health in our cities. You know, in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, it was all around communicable diseases. But pandemic aside, you know, the great challenge of the 21st century, along with climate change, is public health and the increasing cost of non-communicable diseases. And we all know that 1 in 6 adults in the UK deaths is a result of inactivity. And that cost to the country is nearly 7.4 billion per year. And what you're looking at here is the current levels of activity within the country in adults, taken from our Active Lives survey between mid-May 2019 and mid-May 2020. And this is against the CMO guidelines of where to be active, you need to achieve 150 minutes of moderate activity a week. And so what you're really seeing is that 25% of the population is still inactive, doing less than 30 minutes per week. And although activity levels were rising before the pandemic, you know, 3 million adults were less active between March and May 2020 than they were for the same period in 2019. And during the pandemic, everyone has been very much concerned about children's activity levels, and the current levels of activity in terms of the academic year for children between 2019 and 20 was nearly 45% of children were active, but nearly 31% were less active. So next slide, please. So what does this mean? What's the Scalar challenge, and why are local environments really important to physical activity? So this is the top 6 activities. And what you'll see is that the top 3 activities in here, effectively 75% of the nation's activity is essentially walking, fitness, and cycling. And when you think about that and these activities, well, this can all be done in your local places, without any of that specialist cycle equipment or anything like that, apart from swimming. You're probably looking at this. Even 2/3 of football is pretty much recreational football. It's not the full-size game. It is the kick around in the park. It's a small-sided game. So you can see there's a lot of potential around there, improving people's access to quality of those spaces around where people live in their neighbourhoods. And the potential to grow the walking cycling numbers around this is big. When you think about 81% of trips under a mile are done on foot, this drops to 30% for trips between 1 and 2 miles. But 41% of people say that many of their journeys they make by car are less than 2 miles, could more easily be walked. So again, lots of potential around improving people's access to local services via walking and cycling. And that can potentially be grown further with those opportunities we now talk about combo travel, about extending actual travel things beyond further. So when you think about 20-minute neighbourhood concepts, it's linking those neighbourhoods together across a city. And why this is important, walking and cycling, it's particularly important again when you think about if you have things in your doorstep, for those people who are less active or the people sit in the middle category there. Having those activities on their doorsteps is really important for people who may have long-term health conditions to get them confident of moving out in those local environments, going to those shops and doing those journeys. And when we talk about our children's activity levels, the potential to build on that through making those places and spaces safer and more accessible locally is important as well. Because 36% of children have gone for a walk. 50% say they've walked to school and gone to other places, and 24% say they to cycle for fun and fitness. So how do you convert those through behavioural change to make those kids more active in those local places? And initiatives like Play Streets, such as temporary road closures, is a great way of demonstrating how that could happen. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know about what are those activities happening locally. What are the conditions for really generating physical activity? So on the right here, you see our active design principles, which we published with PHE back in 2015, and many of you may be aware of those or use those. But when we flip that around and go back to the characteristics of the places which drive physical activity, what you see on the left-hand side is a reside study. This is a 10-year study in the development of Perth, where some areas were subject to stringent design codes and others were not in terms of control experiment. And what it showed was 50% of residents did 150 minutes walking per week with no other interventions, where all these 12 characteristics happened within places. So you can see the natural attraction of where you can really do good placemaking to actually provide long-term health conditions in a place. But I think the important thing to stress here again is the interlinkages between these built environments and connectivity. And as soon as you start peeling away some of these things, then the less active or the potential people are going to be less active. And some of the examples from Reside, so examples of some of this stuff. So residents who perceive their neighbourhood to be leafy and attractive were almost twice as likely to cycle as a form of transport. The more trees along the footpath network, the more likely residents would like to walk for more than 1 hour per week. And participants with access to at least one high quality park within a neighbourhood were twice as likely to have better mental health. And Helen Griffiths will talk about the benefits of green space this afternoon. But what you'll see in the report that's been prepared by the TCPA is a lot of those elements of the kind of Reside study are actually within that in terms of 20-minute neighbourhoods. So next slide, please. So I suppose bringing this back together, what has COVID given us in terms of the opportunity around the 20-minute neighbourhood concept? And there's a couple of important stats here that's come from our studies we've been doing through a Combo survey around here. One is this we know that there's been increased walking and cycling during the pandemic, but also this propensity to people to say that they actually enjoyed it and they want to do it further in the future. So how can we build on that kind of behavioural change that's already started? We've also seen that increased use of local green space, reinforcing those parks and spaces that were not previously used, and that important value to those local communities. But on that flip side, what the pandemic has also highlighted is those inequalities in access for those local communities who don't have access to the green space and have not had access to other services locally. And what we're now seeing, we've been working with a lot of local authorities in leisure recovery and working with leisure services, is as they're looking at their contracts and how their contracts work on how they before I close it in a way, the built facilities, they're really thinking about, well, how can we use this to do things differently? You know, how can we bring together closer our kind of built facilities with our natural, the parks, making a closer link between park and built leisure provision? How do we bring the indoors and outdoors together, whilst also thinking about how do they look across their local places to deal with inequalities and access? You know, and as though leisure has been dealing with the fallout from the pandemic, we know that all the other areas locally have been dealing with as well. And some of these issues were all happening before the pandemic. So we know the challenges around retail, the challenge around declining public transport use. And on top of that, we have also those opportunities and challenges around, you know, the continued need for housing provision and climate change. So how can we all work together around, you know, with mutually important objectives more collaboratively in the local areas to solve some of these problems? And, you know, we've launched our new strategy, United the Movement, and we have, you know, an area there called Active Environments that Fiona mentioned already. And so we see this as a great opportunity to reinforce neighbourhoods around walking and cycling with access to local services to generate more of that everyday activity in people's lives. And we're also thinking about how do we look at leisure differently in leisure provision, you know, smaller facilities, local facilities based on local needs, with those more strategic ones being accessed in those centres more via public transport. And on top of that is how do you, in a time when we have all the challenges, local authority finance and finance levy, how do you co-locate services again better? So whether that be art, sports, libraries together, healthy wellbeing centres. And you'll see an example of Great Sankey within the guide, which is one of our combined health and facility with a library, and making that better use of school assets locally. But I think also we're going to see is that increasing role of communities in local places, and the importance of working with them but not doing to them in terms of the solutions we develop around this area. But if we are truly to make 20-minute neighbourhoods and create those better places to live and then create those healthier, active communities, it requires not only planning in this, but it requires a joined up approach around partners, both nationally and locally. So nationally, when you think about the way the government delivers its funding, you know, very much a silo bit, but there is the opportunity around shared outcomes. And there is the opportunity this year, as we go through another round of the comprehensive spending review, to think about how we can join up some of those initiatives nationally, so they don't all land in silos locally. And of course, we have the opportunities of the planning bill and planning reforms as well to drive change. But locally, this is a challenge. This is a challenge across those tiers of local government and local service delivery. And it does need to go hand in hand with re-imaging service design around people locally and the way that we're going to live as we recover from COVID. And that effectively requires a systems-led approach. And to do that, we do need to work across sectors. We need to create those partnerships if we're really to create healthier, active, prosperous communities. And that is it. So thank you very much for that. And over to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Nick. We will, as people will remember, hopefully from the agenda, we've got a Q&A session with all three of our speakers after they've all spoken. So we'll have a chance to ask Nick some questions later on, but I will now quickly hand over to our next speaker, who is Julia Thrift. Julia is the TCPA's Director of Healthier Placemaking, and she works to facilitate cross-disciplinary collaboration to create well-designed places, spaces and buildings that make it easier for people to live healthier lives. Earlier in her career, she was the director at the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, and she's also a trustee for Trees for Cities. So over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about the 20-minute neighbourhood, or the 15-minute city, or even the 1-minute city, as I've heard it described recently. So what are we talking about, given all these different numbers and descriptions, and why does it matter now? Next slide, please. So all around the world, places are facing very similar problems. So whether you're in Paris or Portland in Oregon or in London or Edinburgh or in more rural areas, there are very, very similar problems which different places are trying to tackle. So many town centres are clogged up with cars. So what should be a quick journey becomes a very slow journey and an unattractive journey. Walking and cycling in many places are often unattractive, at worst dangerous. And all of that's leading to increased air pollution. And in the last few years, our understanding of the many detrimental effects of air pollution is growing, and people's awareness of the problems it's causing are growing. And there's an increased desire to do something about this. Next slide, please. And other challenges which are being faced around the world include very cheap, unhealthy food, which you can buy almost anywhere and is offered to you in tempting ways almost anywhere. In many of our towns and cities and villages, green spaces, if they're there, they're not always easy to reach, and they're not always very good quality. So the fact that you have a park is not much help if it's got a dual carriageway between where you live and the park, and certainly no good for kids or people who are a bit more frail. So we need to do something about transforming our places so that we can actually reach the facilities we need to get to without having to cross dangerous roads. And throughout the world, places are discovering that they're not resilient to climate change. Places are flooding, they're getting heat waves, and that causes obviously enormous damage to property, but enormous damage to people as well. Incredibly stressful if your home floods, and the effects of that can last for years. So very disparate places in completely different parts of the world are facing very similar problems and have been thinking about how to tackle them. Next slide, please. And at the same time, there's been an increasing amount of research generating evidence about the influence of the places where we live on our health. In England, in 2008, Sir Michael Marmot did his very influential review, Fair Society, Healthy Lives, which looked at the health inequalities in England and looked at what was causing them. And one of the many causes was the places where people live, the homes they live in, the neighbourhoods they live in, and the opportunities that and the choices that are shaped by the places where we live. In 2017, Public Health England reviewed all of the evidence about the links between places and health and came up with this incredibly useful document, Spatial Planning for Health, an evidence resource, which sets out, based on the evidence, how we could design and manage places to support people's health. And the TCPA, for the last 8 or 9 years, has done an immense amount of work looking at the links between place and health and providing free guidance. So if you're interested in planning healthier places, do have a look at our website because there's a lot of free resources there. Next slide, please. So in all of these different places around the world, common priorities are emerging to try and address these multiple problems. Firstly, the need to reduce the need to travel. So we generate an awful lot of journeys. Can we change the way that our lives are structured and our places are structured so that we don't need to travel so often, so far? And one of the ways of doing that is to create complete places. That is, places that have all the things that most people need most days on the doorstep. So that can be shops, it could be schools, health centres, job opportunities, green spaces. So it's the idea of creating complete places that reduce the need to travel. And when we do need to travel, creating places that are compact and connected encourages us to walk and cycle. So if you want to get from A to B, but you have to go all around the houses, you're much more likely to jump in the car. If there's a pleasant and attractive route that you could walk down and maybe bump into some friends, have a chat, you're much more likely to walk or cycle. So the structure and the design of places influences whether or not we're willing to walk or cycle. And later today, Ed Parham of Space Syntax is going to be talking more about this. So many places around the world are coming to the same conclusion, that we need complete, compact and connected places. And interestingly, that's exactly what the evidence that was collected in Spatial Planning for Health suggested. It recommends we build complete and compact neighbourhoods. Next slide, please. And thinking about the link between places and health, before the pandemic, when we were talking to people about this, some people sort of got it and some people didn't. What's been transformed over the last year with the experience that we've all had of being locked down is that the understanding that the places where we live influence our health and well-being, it is now everybody gets it. Nobody really questions it. And people's experience of the pandemic has been so different depending on where they live. Those two photographs in that slide are taken in places that are about a mile apart from each other. And I'm sure that the experience of the people living in the flats above the shop compared with the people living in the flats overlooking the lovely green space would have been very, very different. You know, we all get it now. And I think there is a real appetite to change. There's a real appetite to create places where it's easier for everyone to live a healthy, happy life. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, some places have been thinking about this long before the pandemic and have done a lot of work, but they've all started from different places, even though they've come up with quite similar conclusions. So in Paris, for the last 8 or 9 years, they've been developing a project which is now called the 15-minute city. It started because the mayor, Anne Hidalgo, wanted to reduce the amount of traffic in Paris. Every morning and every evening, there was an enormous amount of commuting as people drove from one side of the city to the other, causing immense traffic jams, air pollution, and so on. So it started about, can we help people live locally? And since then, the project has grown and developed. It's really interesting. And we have a case study about this in the guide that we've published today. So a lot of it's about time. It's about reducing the time we spend doing stupid things like sitting in cars. Next slide, please. In Melbourne, in Australia, again, they've been working on this for several years now. And that started with a very strong focus on public health. It was about helping to get people active. There was a strong partnership between the planners and the Heart Foundation in Australia. And so a big focus on physical activity, helping people become more active, because as Nick described earlier, there are immense physical and mental health benefits to even moderate amounts of physical activity. So although Paris and Melbourne started with different priorities, they've actually ended up with quite similar ideas of what needs to be done to improve their cities. Next slide, please. And Portland in Oregon started with a big emphasis on climate change. The political leaders in Portland really wanted to address climate change, and that started them thinking about what they needed to do in Portland. And again, it led to the same conclusion that what was needed is complete and compact places. And in Portland, they've used a lot of data and analysis to map which places are complete, which places, if you live in a particular place, can you get the sort of things that you need day to day? So the areas in yellow are complete and the areas in blue are less complete. So a lot of data and analysis. And that's come out very strongly in the research we've done, that it's really important to understand the place that you're working with and how it works. And nowadays it's much easier to get that sort of data. Next slide, please. So having spoken to many different places, including Portland and Melbourne and Paris, and done other research and worked with a wide coalition of partners in England, we've come up with a list of potential ingredients for complete and compact 20-minute neighbourhoods, 15-minute cities, whatever you like to call them. But it's absolutely vital that this isn't a sort of, we're not saying this is what every single place should have. It's absolutely vital that each place works with its community in its own context, with its own landscape, its own history, its own culture, to agree what's needed in that particular place. It has to be about what works in a particular location. And it has to be focused on the needs of the people who have less choice. So it's absolutely vital that, for instance, if you're reconfiguring streets, you talk to people with disabilities, who are less mobile, to make sure that any reconfigurations work for them. Changing places is always a compromise. There'll never be a solution that's 100% perfect for everybody, but unless you really understand what different sectors need, what old people, young people, unemployed people, working people need in a place, it's just not going to work. But generally speaking, these are the features we think most complete and compact places will need. Diverse and affordable homes is absolutely vital. All of the places we've spoken to have been well aware that creating places that people really want to live in will put pressure on property prices and property values, and there is a risk of gentrification. It's absolutely vital that there are affordable homes and diverse homes so that you can live in that neighbourhood as your needs change, as you have a family, as you retire, and so on. I think that's going to be quite difficult to achieve in some places in England, and we're not oblivious to the challenges of implementing 20-minute neighbourhoods across the country. Complete and well-connected paths and streets we've mentioned. Schools are a very interesting one in Paris. They're being put right at the heart of plans for 20-minute neighbourhoods. I'm not going to read through the list because you can see what it is. There's much more about this in our guide. And the guide also talks about the challenges of introducing 20-minute neighbourhoods in historic areas, and how there are different challenges if you're introducing 20-minute neighbourhoods in brand new places, or indeed in post-war areas, which were very often designed for cars, and transforming those into 20-minute neighbourhoods is going to present different challenges. Some of that's going to be discussed at today's conference, but there was far more than we could fit into the conference. So do have a look at the guide. There's also a section on how this might be done in more rural areas as well. And it's also important, I think, to say that it probably won't be right first time. Places are incredibly complex and they change, and communities change. So this is going to be a process. You're going to have to find out whether it works or not. You're going to have to change things, adapt things. If you get something wrong, that's not a sign that the entire project is a failure. It means that you need to learn and adapt it. Next slide, please. So how do you know if it's working or not, your 20-minute neighbourhood project? The real question is this a great place to live in or to work in? That's fundamentally what this is about. It's about good planning. It's about good placemaking. So that's the question. We think that the place standard tool, which has been developed in Scotland, is a really practical way of asking that question and finding out what people think about their place. It's also a good way of talking to different groups. What do 9-year-olds think about the place? What do 85-year-olds think about the place? What do shopkeepers think about the place? And there are different groups of people you could ask who might have very different answers. But all of that can help you understand what's working, what isn't working. It can help prioritise investment. In Paris, 25% of the city budget has now been given to local communities to make their own decisions about how to change their neighbourhoods. So I think that's a fascinating example of real community empowerment. It's not just asking people if they like things, it's saying if you need things to change, here's the money to change them. So a really interesting way of doing it. So in Scotland, the idea of having 20-minute neighbourhoods is now being adopted into policy, which is fantastic to hear. And it would be great to see it adopted into policy in England as well. So that's how you know whether it works. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Tim Emery, who's going to be talking about how to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. And as we've mentioned, the guide does cover a huge range of things, including how this might work in rural areas, recognising some of the challenges they will face with complete compact communities, and perhaps we can pick that back up in the Q&A as well. But now we have our third and final speaker of this session. Tim is our policy officer for Healthier Places, and he's been leading on the work in relation to the guide and our wider work on reuniting health and planning. Before joining the TCPA, he previously worked as an assistant planning policy officer at Wealdon District Council. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Fiona, and hi everyone. It's incredible the amount of people that are with us today, so thank you, and we really hope that you can stay for the whole day and listen to other speakers. So I'm here really to give a brief introduction to the guide, which we've been working on since the summer last year. And the TCPA with Sport England has been working with lots of different organisations to learn about the 20-minute neighbourhoods and help develop this guide for councils. So the guide is aimed at council planners and how the 20-minute neighbourhood could work within the English planning system, but we hope it is useful for everyone involved in placemaking. So that's from developers to community groups as well. I really want to stress though that the guide does not provide all the answers, and we can discuss some of the challenges later, but this is really the beginning of the conversation. So next slide, please. So what we're going to cover, I'll take you through 3 of the places we've been looking at in particular to inform the guide, which Julia has also highlighted as well. Then we can go through a set of key principles for success about making it happen. And then to finish, we can think about some of the challenges. So next slide, please. So when we started the project, there were 3 places that stood out, which were receiving a lot of attention during the pandemic, which were Portland, Melbourne and Paris. Crucially though, as Julia said, they had already been working on the concept before COVID. So learning from these places and speaking to those colleagues involved have really helped inform the guide. And we can look at these places briefly now. So next slide, please. So Portland actually started looking into the 20-minute neighbourhood way back in 2006 when they began working on their Portland plan. And the City Council found that through their engagement with the community, there was a real interest in making the city more walkable to improve access to the things that people need, as well as understanding, as Julia mentioned, that the 20-minute neighbourhood can support action on climate change. So a project the council undertook was a 20-minute neighbourhood analysis, which mapped the accessibility of the city. They then used this data and evidence to formulate policies in their plan, and they continue to do so. So a key lesson from Portland was building that evidence base. Next slide, please. So some of you might have watched the webinar we put back on in October last year, where we had colleagues from Melbourne talk about their work, which was really useful, and that recording is still up on our website. A key message from Melbourne was that the 20-minute neighbourhood goes beyond town planning. It is a holistic, place-based approach. And in Plan Melbourne, the 20-minute neighbourhood is adopted in planning policy and is a key factor in achieving this has been working in partnership across councils, across different departments and the community. And the pilot project in particular, working with 3 neighbourhoods, has really helped shape this work. Next slide, please. Then moving on to Paris and their vision of becoming a 15-minute city. So the mayor in Paris, Anne Hidalgo, before their re-election last year, had already been doing a lot of work related to tackling climate change, air pollution, inequalities, as part of the city's resilience strategy. So building on this work, the vision of the 15-minute city really came about during their re-election campaign. Now, there are lots of different projects which are supporting this work, and again, emphasises that this goes just beyond town planning. One of which, as Julie mentioned, is the Oasis scheme, where school playgrounds are being transformed into essentially mini pocket parks for the community. And these open up outside school hours. And that idea of the school becoming the capital of the neighbourhood or district is really central to the vision in Paris. So next slide, please. So a set of common principles began to come out of this research into Melbourne, Portland and Paris, which are shown here. But also it was very clear that these principles are fundamental to good placemaking and town planning in general, and are being practiced here at home, just not necessarily under the name of the 20-minute neighbourhood or 15-minute city. And we'll be hearing from lots of examples from other speakers later today. So the guide really reframes many familiar principles, including those found in the NHS Putting Health into Place series, the active design principles from Sport England, and the work on garden cities and new communities by the TCPA. So these principles are both a mixture of theory and practice, and there's lots of overlap, and they're a lot easier to talk about compared to actually doing them. So next slide, please. Just before we look into these principles in a bit more detail, it is important to imagine the process that we're looking at here. So this relates to councils working on local plans or community groups working on their neighbourhood plans, developers drawing up their master plans. So these are the tools that we can use here. And there are hooks in the National Planning Policy Framework, the National Design Guide, and the Draft Model Design Code, which we've highlighted in the guide as well as thinking about the strong links to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So next slide, please. So first, a compelling vision that's well communicated. So having a clear vision with objectives and priorities is really important in order to talk to different stakeholders and create that shared buy-in. So getting everyone on the same page with the same understanding of what is to be achieved will really help with underpinning sort of a coordinated approach to projects related to the 20-minute neighbourhood. And creating that vision should be collaborative and reflect the needs and wants of local people, and communicating that vision to different groups and organisations throughout the process is also really important. One of the case studies in the guide is Helsham Town Council and their neighbourhood plan, which includes a vision to become a 10-minute town. And that vision has really been key to driving the work around their plan and their engagement. We then have strong, inspiring leadership. So one of the best examples of this is Mayor Anne Hidalgo in Paris. Having that strong, visible political leadership at the top has really been important for Paris and the 15-minute city. But who provides that leadership will be different in every place, and multiple leaders are needed. This can't just happen with one person. So whether that is planning officers, planning managers, local councillors, but also local people and grassroots groups to champion the idea of the 20-minute neighbourhood locally. Next slide, please. Next, we have empowered communities. So this is probably one of the most important principles is community engagement, which Nick mentioned as well in his presentation. So local knowledge should not be underestimated, and communities are best placed to know what works in the neighbourhood and what doesn't. And this needs to be more than just an online survey. So engaging with residents and businesses as early as possible so that there is a real sense of ownership. This engagement must also be inclusive and seek out those underrepresented groups, because everyone should have the opportunity to become involved. And all the case studies in the guide have a really strong engagement focus with examples like co-design workshops and walkabout surveys. Next, we have research, data and analysis. So this overlaps with engaging with the community and developing that baseline understanding of how a place functions. So identifying those strengths, weaknesses and opportunities for making neighbourhoods more walkable. So data here is key, whether that is carrying out a survey of how walkable a place is or the quality of cycling and public transport infrastructure, but also things like housing mix, green space provision, shops, services and facilities. All these features and the level of their provision and quality needs to be analysed. So evidence gathering is a fundamental part of plan making, as we know, and using up-to-date data to support policies is really important. And thinking back again to Portland and their analysis and mapping project really underpinned their work on complete and compact neighbourhoods. So next slide, please. So partnership and advocacy. So this again overlaps with community engagement, but also leadership and having that strong vision. So building partnerships across council departments, not just within planning, but between local communities, schools, developers, landowners, housing associations. These are all crucial. This can't happen without a partnership, and it's all about taking that whole systems approach and connecting the dots. And the advocacy and clear messaging behind the vision of the 20-minute neighbourhood is also really important for that coordinated approach. So identifying who needs to be at the table, who should be part of the conversation, and providing that opportunity to bring everyone's skills and experiences together is key. So addressing inequalities. So this should be at the heart of any plans for 20-minute neighbourhoods, as the concept itself is really about making sure everyone has the same access for their day-to-day needs equally. And this is particularly important for those most deprived communities. So investment and funding should be directed to these communities first. Over the past year, as Nick said, our unequal experiences of where we live, our living conditions, what we do and don't have access to have really been highlighted. And in Paris, in particular, their plans for the 15-minute city talk about creating that common base of access for all residents in their neighbourhoods. So that idea of levelling up. Next slide, please. So for planning, we know that adopting policy is crucial. Having those policies and hooks related to things like active travel, walkable neighbourhoods adopted in local plans is a really powerful tool to influence outcomes. So policies should set out a clear expectation of what is required and the strengths, and that strengthens the ability to deliver projects on the ground. So using best practice guidance to support policy was really key in Melbourne, and the use of Healthy Active by Design, which is the Australian equivalent to the active design principles from Sport England here, really helped shape policy and also communication between different groups. So it's not about starting from scratch. There's lots of useful tools and guidance already out there. Investment, this is a really obvious point that needs to be made. This is both financially, but also including staff time and resources is needed to support projects, and finding sources of funding can be really challenging. But we can think about existing sources of funding related to planning. So we have community infrastructure levy, section 106 agreements can be used as well. And the Department for Transport is increasingly committed to supporting councils. So thinking about the active travel funding this past year, and hopefully things like that will continue. Next slide, please. So hard and soft measures. This relates to the fact that when we think about planning, it's usually those hard infrastructure measures like new buildings, homes, facilities, roads, and providing green space. But there is that other side of the coin, which is really important. So those softer measures, which relate to service design, how spaces are then used and managed and maintained is also needed. And it's about influencing behavior. So we can't force people to travel actively, but those softer measures are really important to try. So whether that's having walk to school programs or community food growing groups, sports clubs, these are the kind of things that we need to think about as well. And having those soft measures can also relate to the flexibility and mixed use of spaces. So that idea of providing more than one service in one place. So thinking again back to Paris and the school playgrounds being opened up for the community. And finally, evaluation and adaptation. So monitoring outcomes is really important to understand if projects are actually making a difference. And if they're not, how can we adapt them? Monitoring is, as we know, is a fundamental part of plan making. So it's identifying those key indicators that will clearly show if something's working or not. And again, more than just a tick box exercise, but actually talking to people that are living there. And Julia mentioned the place standard tool, which we highlight in the guide as a really, really useful tool. So next slide, please. So just to finish before the Q&As, we can go over some of the challenges, because it's really important to appreciate that this all sounds really easy when clearly it is not. And this is a long-term project with lots of barriers along the way. So some of these challenges have come out from the research into Portland, Melbourne and Paris, but we've also added some here that really need to be here. So the capacity of local authorities, we need to appreciate, especially during the pandemic, how stretched, under-resourced and underfunded local authorities are right now. And the capacity of planning teams to actually do this is a challenge in itself. We have policy enforcement and uncertainty. So we know if policies aren't in place, it can be really difficult to enforce requirements if they're not mandatory to deliver. But we also have the added challenge right now of the planning white paper and that uncertainty of the policy landscape right now. There's also the risk of thinking about the 20-minute neighbourhood being like bubbles, and realistically, can everything everyone needs be within a 20-minute radius, especially when we're thinking about rural areas? So places will be dependent on their wider geographical scales and their patterns of connections to things like transport infrastructure in the first place. Investment and funding again, but also thinking about new developments. So sometimes that social infrastructure, that public transport is unviable for developers sometimes until lots of residents are living there to use those facilities. So that is a challenge. Thinking again back to behaviour change. So you can't force people to travel actively, and behaviour change takes time. And Julie mentioned about concerns to gentrification. So this could be a project in itself, and how improving places can result in rising prices and displacing people on lower incomes out of the area is a real problem and challenge. And then finally, concerns around new neighbourhood measures. So sadly, there is often a very vocal minority of residents, often the car lobby, which oppose improvements to things like walking and cycling because it takes away very important space from cars. So trying to work with people to make them understand the multiple benefits of creating walkable, compact neighbourhoods is itself a challenge. Next slide, please. So thank you. Please check out our website. We will be uploading a recording of today. And if there are any local authorities that are out there that are interested in working with us, we do have capacity support. So please do get in touch. And that's me.
Many thanks, Tim. So if I could ask Julia and Nick to put their cameras back on so they can rejoin our virtual panel, please. And thank you everyone that's submitting questions. I'm trying to keep an eye on them. There are definitely some themes emerging. So if I don't ask your exact question, hopefully I can pull some of the themes together that people are asking to try and cover as much as we can during this discussion. So I guess unsurprisingly, there are quite a lot of questions around whether or not the 20-minute concept is only useful for cities and urban areas, and what might it mean for a borough that has a large rural area where, of course, services are more dispersed. And also a question around, are we expecting people in rural areas to drive to a town or a city and walk once they're there? So I wonder, perhaps Julia, if you might pick this one up in the first instance, how can we apply this usefully in rural areas?
It's a really good question, and I think we don't have all the answers to this, and definitely more research and work with rural areas needs to be done. In the guide, we point to two examples that seem to be emerging. One is with market towns and the potential to create market towns that are themselves 20-minute neighbourhoods, and Hailsham has done this with its neighbourhood plan. And that could then mean that if people from the nearby rural areas go to that one place, make that one journey, once they get there, they will be in a 20-minute neighbourhood. The whole idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods does rely quite strongly on having good public transport networks. And obviously public transport in rural areas is a huge problem. If you could get a bus into your market town and then be in a 20-minute neighbourhood, that would be great, but in many rural areas that just isn't possible. Another model that's emerging is for places which don't have market towns, which have lots of small settlements, and that's about how they can be better connected. There was a really interesting award-winning proposal called Velocity, which we reference in our guide, which is about linking up more rural areas in that way. There's also some very interesting work going on with things like the Slowways project to link settlements with good walking infrastructure. So I think it's a sort of emerging area. A lot more work needs to be done, but I think we also have to be honest and say it's not going to work without an investment in rural public transport, which is so desperately needed. Planners on their own can't just sort of fix this problem. But there's a lot that can be done, because I certainly wouldn't walk or cycle down a rural lane because some huge tractor might come bombing past. It would be terrifying. And there aren't pavements in rural areas very often. So there are lots of challenges. But if we think back to the past, rural areas were walkable. People did walk from one village to another. And some of this might be about rediscovering those routes and making them safer, pleasant, and more attractive again.
Thank you, Julia. And Tim and Nick, do wave at me if you want to come in at any moment. Just to reiterate, please, I know lots of people are putting questions in the chat. If you could possibly put them in the Q&A function, just so we can try and keep them in one place rather than having to look across both, it would be really helpful. So please, if you put something in the chat that you'd like us to try and pick up with the panel, please do try and copy and paste them into the Q&A function, which again should be at the bottom of your screen, just very close to the chat function. So I know, Nick, in your presentation, and we've talked about, there's really striking data about the importance of active environments and making that link between planning and health and people's well-being. But people rightly have raised the point that not everybody does get that. So if somebody has pointed to the evidence of vocal opposition to LTNs and cycle lanes, which I know we've been seeing, and of course, lots of, so again, somebody else has pointed to car ownership and it being almost an identity for some people rather than about convenience. So I think there's a broad question about how do we get either local authorities to better understand, but also areas of the community. So Nick, I wondered if there might be some experience from Sport England's point of view around how you've perhaps been able to take people on that journey, I guess, around the importance of active environments, and then perhaps we'll come to Tim and Julia as well.
Yeah, I mean, I talked about the effort of doing with the community and not doing to them, and I think the LTNs comes up as quite a kind of all the time at the moment, and I don't think actually a lot of them aren't proper LTNs. It's a word that's been banded around, sticking a few bollards at the end of a road, stopping our car access, hasn't is not a low traffic neighbourhood compared to something you've seen in Waltham Forest. You know, they spent nearly 30 million in that scheme, and that's taken years to evolve and face public challenges around it. And what is quite clear from the DfT's investment, which is a correct investment, I think, to make to start off the journey and look at the opportunity to build on walking and cycling in the pandemic, is in what happened was the rush to get the money out meant that a lot of the schemes went forward were not really thought out, and they didn't have that public consultation. And I can look at around the corner where I live, which is in Hammersmith, and look across the border to Ealing, where there's absolutely it is a major issue at the moment. Putting up closing roads off and then putting a traffic camera and charging loads of people when you go down the road when no one really knows about it during a pandemic is not the best way to sell to a local community the benefits of walking and cycling. So I think it really comes back to having that public consultation and the investments. What the DfT's money did do is those places which already had like a local cycling walking investment plan in place. So they've done all that consultation with the community. What it's enabled them is to jumpstart that process, and those have been very effective. And there's quite a few studies now coming out from DfT, and people saying, oh, it's had a negative effect. And Rachel Aldridge, who's at University of Westminster, produced a report towards the end of November saying it was, the introduction of low traffic neighbourhoods does not disadvantage some of the, our worst off communities. In fact, it's an equal spread of what's happening. So I think the first point of view, it is coming to really having that conversations with local communities about their aspirations and what they want in their local area. And it is always the problem with planning, because we always move on very quickly. We get charged for our local plans, and there's this process we have to follow. We do not have enough proper time to actually do that co-creation with local communities.
Yeah, thank you. Julia or Tim?
I can go, Julia. Do you want?
Go on, Tim.
I mean, nothing more to add to it, but definitely that community engagement is key and making people aware of the benefits. But it is really hard to try and convince the car lobby that public transport, walking, cycling, active travel is a good thing, but it's making those co-benefits more aware. So improving the high street will improve businesses, but it's also taking people to these places to see that it's working. I think it's all right telling people, but show me, and that's really important. So that idea of local councillors going to places like Waltham Forest to see that it's working is really important.
If I could come in as well, this also ties back to the two principles about having really good data and about political leadership. If you have really good data about how the space is being used, and then you change it and you then have really good data again, you can make sure that you're basing decisions on what's actually happening and not on misinformation. And there is an awful lot of misinformation out there at the moment. That doesn't mean that all the complaints about low traffic neighbourhoods are wrong. Sometimes they're not right first time. Places are incredibly complex. And I think the rush last summer to implement them wasn't helpful at all. Certainly, I'm furious that a perfectly good bike route has been closed and a really bad bike route has been introduced at vast expense. Not good. In my local area, but there are also there has been misinformation about who benefits and who doesn't benefit, and it's really vital to have good data about who's there, who has cars, who doesn't have cars, and talk to people about the benefits and work with them. There's a really good case study in the report of St Denny's in Southampton, where a very grassroots project has helped transform a neighbourhood, and it was working with local people and talking to them about that place, and it seems to have worked very well. But these things take time, so rushing it doesn't help. But a combination of really good information, a willingness to change if you don't get it right first time, and political leaders who are willing to say, if we want to reduce air pollution in this area, we have to stop the rat running. I think we're slightly as a nation in denial at the moment. The same with climate change, that we've signed up to a very challenging aspiration around net zero, but at the same time lots of decisions are being made which completely contradict it. So we're in a funny place as a nation, but I think the benefits when it works well are so obvious that people will come around to it. And as for the cars as part of your identity, I agree. I think that's actually a generational thing. The younger people I know don't see owning a car as part of being an adult in the way that I think older generations did. So perhaps there's a generational change on its way. I don't know.
Thank you. I think the emphasis on collaboration and working in partnership has obviously been clear, both with the community and of course across the diversity of actually the elements of a compact, complete community as well. Somebody has asked around, whilst recognising the importance of partnerships and collaboration, who should be charged with actual delivery? And I know you've obviously highlighted the importance of leadership. Tim, I wondered if there was anything more you might be able to say around the Paris example, where actually there really has been sort of political leadership has been key to driving forward the concept.
Yeah, definitely. So definitely Paris is probably one of the strongest examples of that top level political leadership right at the top. But it is important that it isn't just the mayor. There is such a massive team, a massive partnership behind her as well, and it can't be one person. It can't be one leader. You need leaders across different departments, across different councils, but also that community side as well. So in Melbourne, it was a really strong partnership between the local authority and the community. So it is connecting the dots, working out who needs to be part of that partnership, to deliver projects on the ground, because it can't be one person at all.
Thank you. So Nick, I know you mentioned planning reform as a possibly an opportunity for tackling some of these issues. There has been a question around whether the views, I guess, of Sport England in relation to the National Design Guide, and whether you feel that will help or hinder. Specifically, someone has raised frustration that active design is omitted from that. So perhaps if you might comment on that, and then perhaps the wider planning reform agenda, and whether you feel this could be useful in terms of delivering some of the concepts that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of the active design bit, yes, there is a bit of a frustration, but it's more within that, in the design guide, that it hasn't really, to us, really pushed the bit around physical activity enough within that. It's very much, and I suppose bringing in together the benefits of why you need really vibrant local neighbourhoods and the potential of what that would give around social sort of change. The issue, I think, is, one of the interesting things about what we've tried to do with active design is less bothered around whether it's mentioned or not. It's the principles that are important, because we have, active by design by the Design Council, and one of the things the TCPA did a few years ago was looking at developers, around getting confused because there's so many guides out there, essentially. So if we got the National Design Code, yes, as long as it's got all the right elements in it, it should make it easier for things. And we've, for example, mapped active design against BRE and the Homes Quality Mark to make it easier for developers to look at that. So yes, not too bothered necessarily around active design not being there. Yes, a bit disappointed, but as long as the principles are in there, that's the most important thing for us as an organisation, I think. In terms of planning reforms, I think, yes, I mean, it's interesting because you could link, if we're going down this kind of if they are going to put greater emphasis on there, there's potential with the 20-minute neighbourhood thing to be really at the heart of that. But of course, there's some problems we know, which is at the moment. So again, the changes that we've seen, we had a positive change over within use class order over the summer, where it was going to make it easier to change from what was commercial to leisure use, which, for a lot of our people, it was very positive when you think about town centres being able to change vacant buildings into a leisure use, the opportunities around the towns fund and everything else that goes on there. And then, of course, you've got the change from permitted development rights, which now says, well, no, actually, we're just going to change all that same thing to housing. So you think you're going one step forward. And I think that is, again, as you've highlighted, the permitted development rights, if you're trying to really think about the 20-minute neighbourhood or think about rebuilding town centres, you can't just have a whole load of housing just chucked in there. You need to have these supporting services. So I think that is one of the big challenges we've got with some of the planning bits at the moment.
Thanks, Nick. And yes, I think the sort of future of high streets has come up quite a lot in the questions around that recognition of what is a good centre, and rightly people are raising concerns around permitted development rights and the current direction of travel, I think, with government around that potential loss of control around, you know, the mix of residential and other services. Julia, I wondered if you had any reflections on that from a TCPA point of view.
Yes, I mean it's tricky. I think the pandemic really has highlighted the links between health and place. Even if people are a bit upset about some low traffic neighbourhoods, I think we can put that to one side. People do understand that the places where we live influence our health, and that there's a strong link between planning and design of places and people's health and health inequalities, and that some decisions can make health inequalities worse and some don't. In other countries, I think that link between planning and health has really gone up the agenda. It's interesting to see the new Welsh documents, which right at the very beginning talk about planning healthier places. That's a key, you know, that's what we should be doing with planning, is to create places where everyone can live healthy lives. I don't think we've quite got there in terms of English policy. The National Design Guide has a lot of good stuff in it, which is very supportive of creating healthy places. But the NPPF, the section around healthy placemaking, I think is paragraph, is it 91 or 81? I can't quite remember, but it's not paragraph 1, 2, or 3. So I think we need a sort of, you know, my personal view is perhaps we need more of a sort of system change, that now that the evidence is there, that the places we live in support our health, that we need to have a sort of systematic look at planning. And the recent changes to permitted development, you know, there could be some things that are good that come out of them, but they also mean that councils have far less control over places. And so it makes it far harder for councils to address things like health and health inequalities, because so much new development, and in some places it's an awful lot of the new development will be outside the conventional planning system. It won't require planning permission. So I think there are slightly mixed messages in planning policy at the moment, which are really not helpful.
Absolutely. And I would just mention with the TCPA is just finalising its response to the draft National Planning Policy Framework, the suggested changes to it, and among other things, we'll be raising our concerns about the proposed new language in relation to Article 4 directions, in terms of just saying that they've gone far too far, and actually that's the one tool currently available to local authorities to actually try and maintain some of that control, to actually shape places rather than innate the permitted development rights, which of course, as Julia rightly highlighted, are leading our concern is to an absolute loss of control, particularly in town centres with the Class E change of use. We've also had, again, a topical question, sadly, or sadly because of it being topical, but someone has asked, how can we secure gender equality in 20-minute neighbourhoods? And that includes safer walking environments, but also things like netball courts or perhaps sports facilities that perhaps are more, you know, used by women and girls, perhaps than men and boys. So Nick, I wondered if you might have a thought on some of that sports facilities side of things, or of course the wider question, and then perhaps come to Julia.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes back to how do we apply the kind of universal design principles, you know, that or the, you know, the concept of the 8 or 80 city, and particularly I think with what we've seen of the events of the last week, actually has come out in some of the feedback that we get back, you know, that where we've worked with Hackney on local delivery pilot scheme, which has really good green spaces, they found that the issue is not the green space itself, it is the design of it's actually the entries into those parks and the routes and creating those safe routes. And I think there's a bit that we can apply all the nice design bits to the actual facility or whatever it is itself, but it's actually as much of the issue of the experience of women walking and feeling safe walking to those facilities. And the other aspects come out quite a lot is actually some of the basics that we find with kind of gender equality around some of this stuff. So even when we've done a lot of research with football, you know, the number one thing they actually wanted was clean and accessible toilets within parks, you know, and I think we all know that from across most groups that we want those benefits. And I think the challenge we got with Sport England is actually getting that across to some of our sports and governing bodies. We have this challenge around with, you know, we invest money through the Football Foundation, you know, and they will look purely at investing in that kind of facility itself, but not thinking about what sits around that facility and putting some money in, which actually would help with a lot of those kind of issues that were raised around some of the gender equality issues.
Nick, Julia?
Yes, I agree with what Nick says. It's about listening to people, and you know, particularly women, but also older people and children and teenagers, and listening to what they say and acting on it. And I think an enormous number of public spaces aren't comfortable places for women to be in, but equally they aren't comfortable often for older people, and they're pretty hopeless for kids. So we have for many years designed the public realm, you know, very often by young men for young men, to exaggerate, and that's not true everywhere, but there is quite a lot of that. And it is partly about the way places are planned and designed. It's also very much about how they're managed. So parks that have members of staff on site are often felt to be much safer. Parks that have good loos are going to be much more attractive to many sections of the population. But all of that is investment. It's investment in the public realm. And it's been something that's been very easy to cut, I think, in over the last few years. So that sort of there's a design thing, there's a management thing, and there's a much bigger issue about changing society. It's not badly designed public spaces that mug women. It's very often men, sadly. So there's a bigger question that's way beyond the things we're talking about today, but also needs to be thought about and addressed.
Thank you. So we've talked about rural areas again. I recognise people are following up with that question, you know, and absolutely, as Julia said, I think there's recognition that it's challenging, and someone rightly said that we're unlikely to be able to replace cars with public transport in all rural areas. Absolutely, that is challenging, but there's also been a few questions about actually the suburbs. So I think that there's a sense in the questions that this might work for city centres or urban centres. We've talked about rural areas. What about the suburbs? What does it mean for them? And someone has asked, do we need a different approach or a separate toolkit to be developed for the suburbs? So Tim, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, that's a big one. I guess it goes back to that idea of the Garden City principles, new communities, those extensions of places in themselves, making sure that you know the links that are already there, potentially, and building upon them. So making sure that these places aren't built with no services or facilities at all. It's definitely making sure that things are in early as possible, thinking back to that behaviour change as well. So if those services, facilities, public transport isn't there in the first place, then people are ultimately going to switch to using their cars because that's the only thing that they know. So it is a real challenge. I don't have the answer, but it's something that we need to look into more. Yeah.
Favorite Nick, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it is a challenge because it's also how, particularly when you come to the retrofitting of where things are, because if you think that, you know, a lot of those things post from 80s, you know, you had development, a lot of cul-de-sacs and a lot of things like that. So, and I think when Space Syntax come on to talk about that, you know, the permeability of those areas to make it easy to walk and cycle around those places. You know, during the 1960s, you know, you used to have centres based on the old precincts, and you used to have precincts which effectively were a kind of temporary, I suppose, a kind of town or village centre that they created, but those have kind of all fallen away. So how you then create those places, particularly local services in those places to walk and cycle, or want to walk and cycle, will I think be a challenge, but that's something everyone will need to look at in terms of local service delivery.
And I think related to that, we've also had a few questions about finance and the viability question. I think I will try and pick this back up in the second session with some of the people speaking then. But Nick, from a Sport England point of view, is there things from your experience that you could help point people towards? I mean, we've already touched on the fact this isn't just about planning. It is very cross-disciplinary to achieve this. Some people have mentioned highways engineers, who I feel like come up in every single seminar I'm ever involved with as part of the challenge. But again, Nick, I know you've talked about that cross-sector working, and I just wondered if from a Sport England point of view, there is anything around that sort of how do we finance some of this to make it happen on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, the finance thing is not easy. I mean, in terms of the smaller stuff that we've been working on over the last few years is really about, from the impact of the previous the cuts and the changes that happened after 2012 was very much more about communities taking ownership of those facilities. But that is again about empowering those communities, working with people, upskilling all those skills to allow them to manage their own spaces. And so there's a lot of kind of stuff around that, but there's a lot of opportunity around public sector working with the private sector, and again, what you've seen, and the whole point I talk about the whole co-location is where local authorities realised actually it makes much more sense if we share buildings, share things together to make those more financially sustainable in the future. So why you've seen those things like the co-location of libraries with health and well-being, and the health and well-being centres, particularly with working with local NHS trusts, delivering sports facilities actually on the same site, while we talk about the co-location of schools, so that local sports clubs can run those facilities in the evening at the weekends and draw an income back into those local schools. So there's lots of opportunities here for kind of innovation of things around how that might work locally, I think.
Thank you. We've also, I know we've touched on the obviously impacts of the pandemic and COVID, and some people have flagged that whilst it's positive that are more flexibly able to work from different locations, including from home, it does mean that actually part of how they would normally keep active and part of their active travel of going into work has obviously gone. And others have picked up the point around the importance of parks and green spaces, but the lack of funding. So I just wondered if, Julia, perhaps you might reflect a little more on the challenges and opportunities for this agenda that COVID has presented.
Yes. Huge and important questions. And looking at the other questions in the thread as well, we're absolutely not saying that planning can solve all the problems, and that by tinkering around with the planning system or what planners do, that all of this will be delivered. There are some things that planners can do to take this forward, but some of this is about a much bigger shift into thinking, how do we want to live post-pandemic, and how are we going to fund it? And one of the things I find very aggravating is that public sector budgets are so siloed. If we could keep people healthier, then that would reduce costs to the NHS. The cost of physical activity, lack of physical activity to the NHS is huge. The cost of treating illnesses that are linked to poor diets is huge. So we seem to pay for fixing people once they're ill, but are less willing to subsidise things that might help people stay healthy. And those are bigger questions for society which are outside the planning system. But I think they're relevant. The benefits of parks and green spaces to people's physical health and mental health are now really, really well documented. And the usage of local parks, visitor numbers to parks have shot up. As anyone who's been to a park recently would have noticed, they are absolutely rammed. And yet councils have been struggling for the last 10 years or more to fund that very basic service. If we're serious about helping people stay healthy, if we want a population that will be healthier next time there's another pandemic, which sadly experts say is quite likely, then we need to think about investing in those things that keep people healthy. And that's way beyond the planning system. That's big questions about how we want to live as a society. But I think now is a really good moment to be having those big questions. You know, I hope that there might be a shift towards funding those things that help people remain healthy.
Thank you. And Nick, I wondered if you wanted to pick up on some of your earlier comments around the sort of impact of the pandemic and what it might mean for the future.
Yeah, I mean, for us at the moment, we're very much focused at the moment as an organisation on the kind of return to play and people coming out of the pandemic to look at, you know, the activity levels of the nation, which we expect to have gone backwards. And but there is a real opportunity we've set up within United the Movement of looking and trying to do things differently, and that's what we're really trying to do. So we focused on these big issues, but you know, our strategy really focuses on those inequalities. So it's really trying to help those groups, and we're going to be applying the proportional universalism principle to how we work in the future. But a lot of the stuff we got there is also how do we drive innovation within our sector around doing things differently. This is the time now to have those open conversations. So anyone who's attending today, you know, please get in contact, because the danger, of course, as we come back is that we slip into the old ways of working and we go back. When now I think there is an opportunity, as we're going to have further tests on local government finance around this as well, to really think and deliver services differently and deliver things that are very much people-centric and around those problems that people have locally. And it's not going to be an easy challenge, and I don't think we say it's an easy challenge. As Julia said, you know, it's not the planning can deliver this, and we can't deliver this within a silo of sport and physical activity. This has to be done with other partners across public services and with the private sector as well.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think, so we've had a question around schools, which I know, Julia, you mentioned as being at the heart of the community. And I just wondered if you might say a little bit more about that, the example you were talking about around where they're trying to keep schools at the heart of the community, but how do we ensure that's a positive experience, I guess, for the children? I know obviously in urban areas at the moment, there are concerns, as we've talked about, around air quality and things like that. So I just wondered if you might talk briefly a little bit more about that.
Yes, Paris is making schools the heart of the neighbourhood and opening up the school grounds and greening them. And there's really interesting work going on in Amsterdam as well about greening school playgrounds. There are obviously challenges about keeping pupils safe, keeping schools safe, etc., but they are being tackled in Paris. And in fact, Sport England, I think, has some very good guidance on its website that we've referred to in terms of when you're building a new school, how you could design it to be used by the community out of hours. And if you think about it, many schools have great big playing fields. They have lots of facilities which are closed for 6 weeks in the summer holidays, closed at Easter, closed in the evenings. They're incredibly useful resources. But there are challenges to making them more available, but there's great potential there, I think. But I think in our case study, we have more examples of what they've been doing in Paris.
Thank you. And then a final question for this session, and as thank you everybody for your many questions. We've got lots, and I will put some of the themes again to our speakers later this morning, because I think the planning reform, how do we do this, and the viability questions, I think are absolutely will be key to some of the things we're talking about in the second session as well. We touched on the sort of future of town centres and urban centres. Somebody has rightly said, but having people living in those areas is not a bad idea. And of course, but then somebody else has raised a concern that will 20-minute complete neighbourhoods take away trade, business and services from city centres? And again, I suppose it's that sort of balance. But Nick, Tim, Julia, final thoughts on that one, if you will. Tim?
I can go. Yeah, I think it's not taking away anything from town centres. I think it's looking at that broader picture. So it's not thinking the 20-minute neighbourhood's a bubble again. It is that wider scale, how different 20-minute neighbourhoods will relate to each other. So it's that wider benefits. It isn't taken away from town centres. I don't think it's those connections between those places and supporting each other. So.
Thank you, Tim, and apologies for my cat who's now howling in the background. Julia or Nick, any final thoughts?
Well, I think this comes back to allowing councils and communities the ability to shape their places. In many places, having more homes in town centres could be great, could bring life to the town centre, but equally it needs to be balanced with opportunities for shops and other services. And that's where planning comes in. It's about balancing all those different priorities and needs. And that's the concern about the changes to permitted development, that it will mean it will be very difficult to balance those different competing needs and come to a compromise, because it's always going to be a compromise, that, you know, that it's never going to be perfect. But if there's no control over the changes, I think it could be very difficult to achieve good places.
Julia, Nick, final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I see town centres being very, you know, as they change in all their leisure provision and what they become, as being very complementary to the 20-minute neighbourhood. You know, you've got the more accessibility of town centres, but they will have a different offer. You know, it will encourage people to travel in for something. And for us in sport and physical activity, it means leisure uses is, you know, what could be new and exciting to go alongside the residential areas within town centres, and that's a challenge for our sector, to come up with new things that could actually go alongside that kind of retail and that more centralised urban living, which is likely to be, you know, again, a younger generation population and probably a bit of an older population as well.
Thank you very much. So I'm conscious it's almost very close to 11 o'clock. So thank you ever so much to Nick, Julia and Tim for speaking this morning. I know, as we've said, we've started, I think, a really interesting discussion, and we will be able to continue it after the break. From a practical point of view, please, if it's convenient, please do just leave Zoom running during this half-hour break, or if you do need to leave, you should be able to use the same link to just come back. So we will start again at 11:30 with our second session, when, as I said, we'll be able to put some of these challenges to people who are trying to do this in practice, and showcasing some tools that people might like to use. But for now, please do find, hopefully, teas, coffees, whatever beverage is your preferred coffee break in your own kitchens. And I will see you all in half an hour for our second session. Thank you.